Hello, and welcome to this third in the series, Reassessing Anton Bruckner. It's often quoted a description by Gustav Mahler of Anton Bruckner as being half genius, half simpleton. And you'll often see references to Bruckner being misunderstood. The misunderstanding is almost a parallel here in if we consider Beethoven was deaf, but it is us that is deaf to what Beethoven is conveying in his music. And the same applies with Anton Bruckner. So this idea of being a simpleton may be that the word today has a slightly different meaning than when it was said. It would imply, as far as I can see from a modern day perspective, that someone who's a bit stupid. But that is easy to address straight away just by listening, going back to the source, listening to the creative output of Anton Bruckner. And further evidence of this, if you look in the playlist and look at the playlist Symphonic Analysis, Bruckner Symphonic Analysis, you'll get all different perceptions from musicians and analysing the musical compositions, and certainly he was no simpleton. Further to this, it is recorded in Bruckner's lifetime that he had a deep fascination and interest in all sciences, the latest developments and things. But we have to make a distinction here between Bruckner the man and Bruckner the artist to really understand where he's coming from. Now, if you look at a summary of the creative output of a lot of composers, say Joseph Haydn or Wolfgang Mozart or Ludwig van Beethoven as three examples, what you'll often find is the different genres. You'll have quite a lot of output, chamber music, as much as symphonies, piano pieces, songs, choral works, and so on. But when it comes to Bruckner, what really stands out is the almost lack of output in certain genres, where you would expect to possibly find a lot more compositions, for example, organ works or piano pieces. There are very few, and certainly the piano pieces come to an abrupt end in 1868. There are no more compositions by Bruckner in that genre. Of the organ works, they generally predate the symphonies. There's only about 4 or 5, and a few that may be misattributed to Anton Bruckner, but again, only a handful. Chamber works, you only have a very short duet for piano and violin, the string quartet during his study period, and then the masterpiece, which is the string quintet, which has been likened very much to following on where Beethoven left off with his late string quartets, but very little else. If you look at his choral works, you have the what are called the sacred, tied up with religiosity. I can't even say the word. Tied up with religion, and then you have the secular works. Now, if you look at the secular works, generally they're not commissions. In fact, the string quintet was probably only written because it was a commission. Although he was asked for a string quartet, he actually produced a quintet. That was in about 1879. You also have in 1884 what is known as the Perga Prelude for organ. But again, that was a commission. But there are very few commissioned works with Anton Bruckner. He was primarily known as an outstanding improviser of the organ. But where his main output really lies is in the symphony. And once he had started writing symphonies, you have this cohesive flow. As soon as he's finished writing one symphony, he starts another one. In the fantastic book Perspectives on Anton Bruckner, there are many references that those symphonies are autobiographical, and I would, just from listening to the music of those symphonies, that is in part very true. But they are far more than that. There is some who will describe Bruckner as Bruckner the mystic. Others will see him as being more down to earth. I would suggest that it is both. So, for example, Symphony Number 2, I think it's in the first movement, you have this repeated, I think it's a trumpet theme, which I feel he is describing his experience of getting lost in London when he went to represent Austria, playing at Crystal Palace and Alexandra Palace as well. And more likely than not, there's also his experiences of going to France, where he also represented Austria in 1869. But that travelling, performing lifestyle certainly did not fit the temperament of Bruckner the man, because it comes with such uncertainty. And I shall discuss this a little bit later, but suffice to say that the symphonies show a lot of autobiographical things, a lot of things that he observed, and it's also showing the otherworldly in his music. With Bruckner, you have almost two contrasts. You have Bruckner the man and Bruckner the artist. Bruckner the man is very much shaped in structure. It is often described, when talking about his symphonies, about structures of sound. What he was doing throughout his life, I'm sure, is observing architecture. So going to somewhere like Linz and St. Florian, where he is very much intertwined, the impressiveness of the buildings, and yet also you have the regularity and symmetry of the windows in the building. It all sort of reflects the formative years of Anton Bruckner. He comes from a very sort of peasant background. It's just good fortune that his father, and I believe his grandfather, were school teachers as well as organists. So, but children are very perceptive, and even in a small rural country school setting, I feel that it would stand out that Bruckner was very different, highly intelligent, and yet would seem to have almost an imbalance, some sort of quirky idiosyncrasies about him. I feel Bruckner was very much aware of this, so when you come to up to the age of 40, where he is submerged himself in serious study of music, first with Simon Sector and then with Otto Kitzler, it is so he could provide a paper trail of qualifications, because I feel he knew that he would be misunderstood if he tried to speak these things, not helped, of course, with the stigma attached of having a rural country dialect, his almost social awkwardness. He's very much, Bruckner the man is very much fashioned by rigid structures, but within those rigid structures are Bruckner the artist. So when he's taken this step to go to high society Vienna, he would have stood out, just like Beethoven did in Vienna. He would have stood out like a sore thumb, his style of dress. But Bruckner was very much about requiring that regularity. If I was to give a diagnosis of Bruckner, I would say he either has a high level of Asperger's, and interesting, he wrote 3 settings of Asperger's me, small choral pieces, possibly bipolar or autistic. So on the one hand, you have Bruckner, who is very rigid in his ways. With the coming of gaslighting, for example, in houses, he was adamant that he would stick with candles, and very meticulous about going round the house and checking that they were all out, because of the effects of seeing that Vienna ring theatre destroyed by fire. It would have had a profound effect on him. What is true that is said about Bruckner is he is very sensitive. Now that's a double-edged sword. He is very sensitive to criticism, but he is also hypersensitive to the cosmic realms. And this, I feel, is once he'd got this grounding, which really came about in 4 parts. You have the polyphony that he's mastering and had mastered at the age of 25 with his Requiem in D minor. That is worth listening to. It's a masterpiece. But you also have, it is known through his intense study, and I believe the notations on the scores are still accessible to the public, or have been noted, that he did do a deep analysis of Mozart's Requiem and Beethoven's symphonies. So as well as this sort of medieval choral music, which is working within the structure of the Catholic Church, he's now introduced the sort of workings of Mozart and then the structure of the symphony of Beethoven, to which was then added the 4th part, the harmonies that Bruckner was introduced to through Otto Kitzler. And yes, he did idolize Wagner, but had Beethoven been alive, I'm sure he would have got that same adoration from Bruckner. You'll see little glimpses as well of the artist comes out in Bruckner outside the structure of the man. This insistence on, when Beethoven's skeleton was exhumed, that he made a point of going and kissing the skull. Now it is often pointed to his macabre fascination with death. Superficially it could be seen that way, but what I would suggest is there is something far, far deeper with that. It is as if Bruckner had this hypersensitivity, that he knew something of the spirit and something of the soul was left as an imprint within the physical remains. It's interesting as well that at the very end of his life, his wish was that he would basically be mummified. Is that a sort of normal thing to be done? Normally people are either buried or cremated, surely. But he was rested and still rests today under that Bruckner organ in St. Florian. But what else comes out, is often seen in a very negative way with Bruckner, is this so-called counting neurosis. But again, I refer you to really listen to his compositions, and numbers are always prevalent in the structure, particularly of the symphonies. You can count 1 to 8 or 1 to 4 quite easily along with the music. Also his composition technique. It's so easy to have these anecdotal stories from an outside perspective of, oh, Bruckner's suddenly stopped and he's now counting the leaves on a tree or the windows of a building. That is something to do, I feel, with his compositional processes, in that the autobiographical aspect of Bruckner in his symphonies in particular. He's basically telling you a story in pure sound with no words, so the sights and things he saw would be incorporated into those symphonies. We also have to consider he was primarily an organist and renowned for his improvisation. So not only is he playing a piece of music, in his mind it is going far forward. While he's playing, he's already working out several bars ahead where he's taking that music, where he's adapting the theme, where he's playing with it, where he's inverting it. So it's no surprise in the way Bruckner composes, as Sir Simon Rattle has explained, that he is probably unique amongst composers in that he would take a music score, he would work out the exact number of bars that he wanted a symphony to consist of, where the different movements would be of so many bars as well, and then after he'd worked this all out in his head, it then goes down onto paper, onto the score. But he's already put the bar lines in prior to one musical note being written. And this, I feel, is where Bruckner is most definitely misunderstood. You have to understand Bruckner, you have to put yourself in his shoes and consider he was an organist and an improviser. And the way someone would think, the way they would compose would reflect that, and I feel it does very much in those symphonies. I'm no expert on birdsong, but certainly in the woodwinds, in many of the symphonies, the sights of nature are also very much seem to be replicated in the sound. Another example with Bruckner, if you listen to the opening of the first and the last movement of the Fifth Symphony, you have this very reverential sort of dum, 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 sort of this walking theme, like how he would have walked in St. Florian Monastery, making his way up to the organ loft, and when he meets a priest or some high-ranking official within that complex, he would be very reverential. That is something else with Bruckner. He worked within the structure. That is very much, once he's got the structure of the symphony from Beethoven, he doesn't deviate from that. There are no 3 or 5 movement symphonies. They are all 4 movement symphonies. Some will say that the Ninth Symphony is perfectly fine with just 3 movements, but that was never intended. The reason that has gone missing is beautiful in a way because it leaves the story open-ended. In the same way, if we see Bruckner as God's composer, well, is God not infinite? So the story would be reflected that it's infinite, it is without end. So we've covered the macabre aspect, we've covered the so-called counting neurosis, and rather than seeing these things in the negative way from today's perspective of, say, labelling him as autistic and having counting neurosis, to start looking at this in a very different way. Initially by looking at his creative output, why he didn't write in certain genres, why once he was decided on the symphony and the structure of the symphony in the Beethoven model, that was the structure he was then going to work with. So there is a simplicity to Bruckner, and what you'll find, or from my experience of life in general, the answers are always very simple, but it is overlaid with the devil's in the detail, and certainly the conscious mind will always look for problems to solve when they're not actually there, because it requires stepping into the unknown. But this is where Bruckner the artist differs totally from Bruckner the man, in that when we get to the finale of the Ninth Symphony, that is definitely otherworldly. There are elements in Symphonies 7 and 8 as well, and you have that theme of death that increases in those last three symphonies. They become main themes. It is said that Bruckner was very timid. That is not the case. If you listen to the ending of the finale of any of his symphonies, probably the exception would be number 6, which is tied up with his life at the time, maybe having a little bit of second thoughts, am I doing the right thing? Nobody's listening to me, nobody's understanding me, and then having that, I believe it was with Symphony number 7, that even Bruckner said that it came, one of the themes came through as divine guidance, sort of channeled to him. It's like, here's the blueprint, you know how to improvise, have fun with it, and I'm sure that's what he did. We're also fortunate today in having organ transcriptions of the symphonies. Now, to some purists, they say they're not valid, but when you consider where Bruckner would have played out those themes would most likely have been on the organ or on one of his pianos, the Bosendorfer perhaps. And there are piano transcriptions of Bruckner's symphonies. I feel to have a full understanding of Bruckner is to listen not just to the orchestral renditions, but the solo organ and the piano renditions to get a full understanding, because there are subtleties that of flavour, as it were, that come out by hearing the music simplified back to just being played through an organ or a piano rather than a full orchestra. So he is a bit of a conundrum in a way, this half genius, half simpleton. So let's address this simpleton side of things. We have to look at his formative years, that he came from a very rural background. He was very rigid in his ways. He was very respectful of custom and tradition, and once he'd settled on a particular thing, that was it. You only got to think of how he had his hair cut, always with scissors, never with these newfangled clippers. He wouldn't accept that. But he's very rigid in that Bruckner the man side of things. From what I've read, his housekeeper had to cancel orders for something like 30 pairs of shoes or boots near the end of his life, but he was very much set in his ways on one side. But the artist is completely different. I would imagine to meet Bruckner to a lot of people would be very off-putting, because on the one hand you have this personality of the man that comes out, who is maybe very socially awkward, but at the same time, if you got him talking about something he felt very passionate about, like music, you would get the other side of him come out, Bruckner the artist. And I'm sure a lot of people found this so perplexing that they were repelled by him. Not his fault, but all to do with his makeup, to do with his formative years, the fact that he came from a very rural background and that then is put into the complete polar opposite of high society Vienna. So he would have seemed very strange to certain aspects of high society when viewed at a superficial level. I wonder sometimes how Bruckner may have been different had Neville Goddard preceded Anton Bruckner, if he could have been, if it would have been possible for Neville Goddard to explain to Bruckner how to interpret the Bible as an inward story. But I feel Bruckner was heading in that direction. It is often noted about his crisis of faith with the Eighth Symphony, for example. And then you look at his last completed choral work, Helgoland. I'm sure it was not lost on Bruckner that you have this divine act of God that saves the people of Helgoland from these invading Roman ships. And I'm sure it wasn't lost on Bruckner, the sort of crossover from Holy Roman Empire to Holy Roman Catholic Church. The fact that he had his body embalmed rather than being buried is another aspect. But again, it comes back down to Bruckner the man works in structures, so he would still work within the Catholic faith. And certainly he probably wouldn't have been resident at somewhere like St. Florian without conforming to that sort of religious mindset. But within Bruckner is Bruckner the artist that is something very, very different that comes out. He is a fascinating psychological study, but it's so easy to go deep into these things and forget that where we should really be interpreting and hearing Bruckner is in his music, primarily in the symphonies. But I would suggest to go through all the playlists where you'll find something like 97% of his creative output is available through YouTube. So I've put together his symphonies, which you'll find under different conductors, because there are different versions of several of the symphonies, and they are all worth hearing. I would suggest to listen to the symphonies in chronological order as well. But also take a deep dive into various ones as a first taster, as it were. But you're not going to really get any understanding of Bruckner probably on first hearing. It does require the effort to keep listening to the symphonies over and over again, and then allow that communication that is coming through in sound. I'm going to continue this on when we look at the motive as to why I say Bruckner was murdered and why that Ninth Symphony finale went missing. So I'm going to leave that over to the next video, but I hope that has given you a new perspective on how to approach the music of Anton Bruckner and be able to distinguish the huge difference between Bruckner the man and Bruckner the artist. The one is very rigid, the other is very daring and is very inventive. And in very subtle ways, working within the structures, breaks the mold, as it were, and would have done so even further had that finale, those missing those folios had not gone missing. I feel they were stolen to order by someone who knew what they were doing, knew what they were looking for, but we'll come on to that because I feel I have identified the prime suspect for that, possibly the prime suspect for his murder, and also the organization that would have been behind this as well. There is further implications that will come from this that do affect the world today, but I would say to be, well, I feel certainly assured that the presence and the spirit of Bruckner are still very much with us, and that is why his body was embalmed, because the spirit cannot reincarnate into a new body while the previous body still exists. I feel to some degree Bruckner may well have known this, even if he never actually said it. There is a lot of things with Bruckner, like this symphony cycle, it's autobiographical. It may be that he didn't actually start off with that intention, but it evolved, and I feel very early on it did become apparent to Bruckner once he'd got all this mastery of music under his belt with a paper trail that he could prove to people, because I feel he was very much aware of his social awkwardness. So he did his own thing and expressed himself through the music. So I think we'll end that there. This has already run to 30 minutes. So I hope that has given you a new take on things, and also dispelled some of these urban myths that are seen in a very negative way with Bruckner, when they actually make far more sense when you see things simply as they are. The simplest way is to immerse yourself in those symphonies and just feel the music and feel what comes through. That has been my experience. That is the sort of source that I go to for what is coming through that I'm expressing. In some ways, I do follow the pattern, because if you'll notice, I've got no notes. I've not referred to any notes in this video. The plan was to do that, but I thought, let's emulate what Bruckner did with his improvisation, where just go with the flow. We've got it all up here, what I want to say, and we just let it run in the same way that Bruckner would do in his compositional processes with these symphonies and many of his other works. So we'll leave that there, and next video we'll turn to the motive behind his murder, and the suspect, the primary, what I would say is one of the primary suspects, and what is behind all of this. So I hope you've enjoyed this. So until the next video, as I say on my main channel, unconditional love to you all. And on this channel, I'm going to say happy listening to the music.